Hello everybody, I would like to welcome you to our 38th video in the pre-algebra playlist, and in this video we're going to go over the concept of adding and subtracting fractions. So if I ask you to figure out what is 1 over 3 plus 1 over 2, or basically what is 1/3 plus 1/2, what would you do? Would you simply add the numerators together and the denominators together and then tell me that the answer is 2 over 5? Well, no, that's not really how it's done. One of the first things that needs to be done in adding or subtracting fractions is to establish a common denominator. It doesn't matter what the numerator is as long as the denominators are common. So since this right here is not the right answer, how would we go on about establishing a common denominator? If I have some fraction, let's say I have a divided by b, and on top of that I have another fraction such as c divided by d, and if I want to make these two fractions over here have a common denominator, what I would do is that I would take this numerator over here and I would multiply the numerator of this fraction over here with it, as well as the denominator of this fraction over here with that. What do I mean by that? Well, in order to establish a common denominator over here, what I would simply do is that I would do a times d divided by b times d. And then, in order to establish a common denominator for this fraction over here, what I would do is that I would take the denominator of this fraction over here and multiply that with the numerator as well as the denominator. So I would get c times b divided by d times b. And now if you notice, the numerators are not the same, but the denominators are the same. So similarly, if I want to establish a common denominator over here, what I would really need to do is multiply this fraction over here by the denominator over here. So basically this turns into 1 divided by 3, and then to that I would multiply the numerator by the number 2, and then I would also multiply the denominator by the number 2. And then in order to establish a common denominator right here, what I would do is that I would take this denominator over here, which is the number 3, and multiply that to the numerator to give me 1 times 3, and multiply that to the denominator as well to give me 3 times 2. And now you notice that both of the denominators are the same, and therefore I can simplify this over here to give me 1 times 2, or simply 2, divided by 3 times 2, which is simply 6. The plus stays the same, and then 1 times 3 becomes 3, and 2 times 3, or 3 times 2, becomes 6. So this right here, 1 divided by 3 plus 1 divided by 2, is the same thing as saying 2 divided by 6 plus 3 divided by 6. So now what is the answer to this problem over here? Well, whenever you're adding or subtracting fractions, the denominator stays the same. So basically the denominator will remain the 6. And what do you do with the numerators? Well, if I'm adding two fractions, I would simply add the numerators together. If I'm subtracting two fractions, I would subtract the two numerators together. So this right here turns into 2 plus 3 to give me a final numerator of 5. So 1 divided by 3 plus 1 divided by 2 is not equal to 2/5, it is equal to 5 over 6. In this case, let's say I have something such as 3 divided by 8 plus 1 divided by 9. And now, in order to establish a common denominator, I need to multiply this fraction over here with the denominator over here, and this fraction over here with the denominator over here. So what do I mean by this? Well, if I want to establish a common denominator for this fraction over here, what I would do is that I would do 3 divided by 8, and I would multiply the numerator by the number 9, because that is the denominator for the other fraction. Similarly, I would also multiply the denominator by the number 9. So this right here gives me 27 on the top and 72 on the bottom. Now, in order to establish the common denominator for this fraction over here, I would multiply the top and the bottom of this fraction by the denominator of this fraction, which is the number 8. So this right here gives me 8 times 1, which is 8. And on the bottom I have a 72. So now this problem turns into the following: 27 divided by 72 plus 8 divided by 72. Therefore, my final denominator will remain the same. It will stay 72. And then the numerator will be 27 plus 8. Now 27 plus 8 is better known as 35. So this right here turns into 35 divided by 72. So my final answer to 3 divided by 8 plus 1 over 9 is equal to 35 divided by 72. So in this example over here, let's say I have 2 divided by 7 plus 3 divided by 10 plus 4 divided by 5 plus 6 divided by 5. So what I can do is that I can evaluate these two fractions over here to give me 3 fractions. And I can do this because when I'm adding something, or basically when I'm adding multiple terms together, it doesn't matter which order I add them in. So therefore, when I evaluate 4 divided by 5 plus 6 divided by 5, the denominator stays the 5. And then what I do is that I simply add the numerators together to give me 4 plus 6. And when I do that, I get 10. So now my problem over here turns into the following. 2 divided by 7 plus 3 divided by 10 plus 10 divided by 5. So now there are a couple different ways you can go about solving this problem over here. You can evaluate these two fractions over here, these two fractions over here, these two fractions over here, or you can pretty much simply evaluate all of these fractions together. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to establish a common denominator not for any two fractions. I'm going to establish a common denominator for all of these fractions over here. In order to do that, I would not only need to multiply the denominator over here by this denominator over here, but also this denominator over here. If I want to establish a common denominator between these two fractions, what I would do is that I would multiply the numerator and the denominator by the number 10. But since I want to establish a common denominator between all of these three fractions, what I would also need to do is multiply the numerator and the denominator by the number 5. So this right here turns into 2 times 10 times 5, which gives me 100, divided by 7 times 10 times 5, which gives me 350. So this right here is equal to 2 divided by 7. Let's move on and do the same thing with this fraction over here. I would need to multiply this fraction over here by both of the denominators of these fractions. So I would need to multiply the top and the bottom of this fraction by the number 7 as well as the number 5. And when I do that, I get 3 times 7 times 5, which is the same thing as saying 105. And since it's a common denominator, the bottom stays the same. It stays 350. Let's do the same thing for this last fraction over here. So over here, I have 10 divided by 5. And what I would need to do to establish a common denominator for this fraction over here is to multiply both the top and the bottom by the numbers 7 and 10. And when I do this over here, I get 10 times 7, which is 70, times 10, which is 700. And the bottom stays the same. It stays 350. So now that I have established a common denominator for all of these three fractions over here, what I would simply need to do is add up the numerators together. And I leave it up to you to verify this, but when you add up all the numerators together and keep the denominator the same, you get this following number over here. So the answer to this problem over here is 905 divided by 350. Now in most cases, your answer should be in its most simplified terms. This right here is not in its most simplified term. So I leave it up to you to verify this, but when you simplify this fraction over here to its lowest possible terms, you get the following fraction over here. So this right here is the answer that we have been looking for. So now that you know how to establish a common denominator and get the whole concept of adding and subtracting fractions with one another, let me just do a couple of simple examples with subtracting fractions. Let's say I have something such as 2/3 minus 1/5. So in order to establish a common denominator over here, the first thing that I would need to do is multiply this fraction over here by the denominator over here. So this right here gives me 10 on the top and 15 on the bottom. For this fraction over here, what I would need to do is multiply the top and the bottom by the denominator of this fraction over here. And when I do this, I get 3 on the top and 15 on the bottom. So this problem over here turns into the following problem over here. 10 divided by 15 minus 3 divided by 15. Now in order to evaluate this problem over here, all I really need to do is keep the denominator the same and then subtract the numerators like I would do to any two numbers. So on the numerator, I have 10 minus 3, which is the same thing as saying 7. So the answer to the problem 2 divided by 3 minus 1 divided by 5 is 7 divided by 15. So in this example, let's say I have 18 divided by 5 minus 7 divided by 2. In order to establish a common denominator for this fraction over here, what I would do is that I would multiply the top and the bottom by the number 2. And when I do that, I get 36 on the top and 10 on the bottom. Moving on, in order to establish a common denominator for this fraction over here, I would multiply the top and the bottom by the number 5. This right here would give me 35 on the top and 10 on the bottom. So this problem right here turns into 36 divided by 10 minus 35 divided by 10. And when I simplify the numerators with one another and keep the denominator the same, I get 10 as the denominator and 1 as the numerator. So the answer to the problem 18 divided by 5 minus 7 divided by 2 is the same as 1 divided by 10. So that's it for this video. I hope you liked it and I hope you keep on working hard, and I'll see you in the next video when we go over how to multiply and divide fractions.